Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. Running a refrigerated load from Amarillo to Oklahoma City wasn't anything unusual for me. I'd done that stretch of I-40 more times than I could count. It's mostly flat land, long open runs with wind sweeping over the plains, the kind that hums against your mirrors and makes you feel like you're the last person left on the highway. That night I left Amarillo just after sunset, around 7:30. The load was pork boxed and palletized, bound for a distributor in Oklahoma City. The reefer unit was running at 34 degrees, steady hum behind me as I cruised through the dark. By the time I crossed into Oklahoma, I was getting tired. I'd been up since before dawn, and the vibration of the road was starting to make my eyes heavy. The clock on the dash read 11:46 when I saw the sign for the rest area near Elk City. I'd stopped there a few times before. It wasn't big, just 2 rows of parking, a restroom building, a few vending machines that rarely worked, and some dim lights that left most of the lot in shadow. I figured it was good enough for the night. I pulled in, backed into a spot along the far side where the lot met the field, killed the headlights, and let the engine idle a moment before shutting it down. The reefer unit clicked and rumbled as it adjusted, filling the air with its low drone. The night was humid. You could see the vapor from the reefer drifting out like fog, curling through the air. A few other rigs were parked nearby, maybe 6 or 7 in total. Most had their engines off. Some had running lights glowing faintly red. I climbed into the sleeper, kicked off my boots, and stretched out. The hum from the trailer blended with the occasional whoosh of passing cars on the highway. It didn't take long before I started to drift off. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when it happened. Maybe an hour. The sound that woke me wasn't loud, but it was wrong, soft, broken, and human. It took me a few seconds to realize it sounded like crying. A child crying. Muffled, faint, like it was coming through something solid. I lay there, frozen, staring into the dark of the cab. For a second I thought I was dreaming, that maybe the reefer's rumble was messing with my half-asleep brain. But then I heard it again. Small sobs, choked, uneven. My heart kicked hard in my chest. It was coming from behind the cab, from the trailer. I sat up fast, trying to listen through the noise of the unit. The sound seemed to fade, then return. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots without tying them, and stepped outside. The air hit me warm and damp. The lot was quiet except for the hum of machines and the distant hiss of tires on asphalt from the interstate. The vapor from my trailer drifted white against the glow of the rest area lights. For a moment I just stood there, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. Then I heard it again, softer now but definitely there. Crying, from inside. I walked to the back of the trailer, the gravel crunching under my boots. My flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand. The metal sides of the trailer were slick with condensation, and the smell of diesel and cold air mixed in the night. The reefer unit clicked again as it cycled, masking the sound for a few seconds. When it quieted, the crying came again, muffled, uneven, right behind the doors. My stomach dropped. I told myself it had to be something mechanical, wind through the vents, maybe the unit itself echoing. But the sound wasn't random. It had rhythm to it. Pauses, like someone trying to breathe through tears. I unlocked the latch and hesitated. My hands felt heavy. I pulled the handle and swung the door open. The cold hit me instantly, sharp, chemical cold that rolled out like smoke. The beam from my flashlight cut across the stacked pallets of pork boxes, wrapped tight in clear plastic. Rows and rows, neat and identical. Nothing looked out of place. I climbed up onto the bumper, peered inside, shining the light over every corner. My breath made little clouds in the cold air. Nothing moved. No sound except the steady hum from the reefer. I stepped back down, heart still pounding, and waited. The crying had stopped. I stood there for a while trying to listen. Nothing. Just the night. The sound of crickets somewhere in the field, the occasional distant truck pulling in or out. I shut the door again and latched it tight. For a moment I just leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. I walked a slow circle around the trailer, shining the light under it, checking for anything strange. The gravel, the shadow lines, the white vapor drifting from the vents. Everything looked normal, but the silence after that sound felt too deep, like the air had emptied out. Eventually, I climbed back into the cab and sat there, engine off, just listening. The reefer hummed steady, same as always. The digital readout glowed green, 34 degrees. Everything was fine. I tried to tell myself it was just the sound of the compressor cycling wrong, or wind through the vents making weird harmonics. But it hadn't sounded mechanical. It had sounded alive. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Every small sound from the trailer made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard something shift inside like a box sliding, but when I looked back there was nothing. Eventually, I dozed off sitting upright, my flashlight still in my lap. When dawn came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The sky was pale and overcast, the air thick and still. I started the engine, stretched, and drove out. My eyes kept flicking to the side mirrors, half expecting to see something moving behind the trailer. The reefer ran smooth, no alarms, no drops in temperature. I stopped at the way station outside Weatherford to grab coffee and stretch my legs. There was a DOT officer standing near the building checking paperwork. He looked half awake, cup of coffee in hand. I told him what I'd heard, trying to sound casual, but I'm sure my voice shook a little. I said it had sounded like a kid, maybe something trapped. He listened, barely reacting, then said something about how cartels sometimes use produce trailers to smuggle people across the border. Sometimes they end up in the wrong units, even refrigerated ones. He shrugged, said it happens more than people realize. That hit me harder than I expected. I asked him if I should have called someone last night, but he just said if there wasn't anyone there when I opened it, probably nothing to find now. I got back in the truck and just sat there staring at the mirrors again, all the way to Oklahoma City. I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. Every time the reefer unit changed pitch or rattled, my chest tightened. The idea that someone might have been inside, just long enough to cry for help before freezing, wouldn't leave my head. I kept replaying how faint it had sounded, how quickly it had stopped after I opened the doors. When I got to the distributor, they unloaded the trailer fast, forklifts buzzing in and out. I stood by the dock, watching the pallets disappear one by one. I half expected someone to find something, a handprint on the plastic wrap, a scrap of fabric, but there was nothing. Just boxes of pork, perfectly sealed, all accounted for. That night, when I parked in Oklahoma City, I walked back to the trailer again, just out of habit. The air smelled like wet asphalt from an earlier rain. The reefer unit was quiet now, finally off. The metal was still cold to the touch. I put my hand flat against the door and stood there a long time, listening. Nothing. But even with the silence, that sound wouldn't leave my mind. The soft, broken crying somewhere behind the metal, just far enough away that I couldn't tell if it was real or memory. I drove that same route again 2 weeks later. Same stretch of I-40, same rest area near Elk City. This time, I didn't stop there. I passed it doing 70, glancing over at the empty lot as it slid by in the dark. The lights were still dim, the same lonely glow spilling over the pavement. I told myself it was just the reefer, just noise and nerves and fatigue. But part of me knew better. Sometimes when I pull a refrigerated load now, I still hear things. Maybe just the compressor echoing. Maybe something else. I don't open the doors at night anymore. Whatever that sound was, it stopped the moment I looked for it. And I've never stopped wondering if someone was in there. alive for just a few minutes longer than I thought. It was a night run I'd made plenty of times before, Kansas City to Denver, straight west on I-70, mostly empty highways, just me, the hum of the engine, and a thermos of coffee. It was early March 2020, right before everything started shutting down. The roads were quiet that week, too quiet. Most rest stops were half empty. Truck stops had that hollow, uneasy feel. A lot of drivers had started keeping to themselves more, talking less on the CB. The air had that heavy, uncertain tension that came before everything changed. I'd left Kansas City just before sundown, loaded with packaged produce bound for a Denver distribution center. The plan was simple: drive straight through the night, catch a few hours sleep in the yard once I got there, unload in the morning. The run usually took about 9.5 hours if weather cooperated. That night the forecast called for light fog near the state line. Nothing serious. The first few hours were routine. Crossed Topeka, then Salina. Traffic thinning out the further west I got. It was after midnight by the time I passed Hayes. The highway was empty enough that I'd gone 20 minutes without seeing taillights ahead or headlights behind. Just flat, open country and the steady yellow glow of the dash lights. I kept Channel 19 on, mostly for company. Every once in a while, you'd get another driver checking in, talking weather or joking around. That night it was mostly static. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere east of Colby, I caught a voice breakthrough. Female, clear, calm. Rare to hear a woman's voice out there that late. She said, "Eastbound, you got your lights out." I glanced down immediately. Headlights were fine. Low beams on, trailer lights glowing red in the mirrors, dash indicators all normal. I keyed the mic. "Copy that, I'm lit," I said, half laughing. I thought maybe she had the wrong truck. A soft laugh came through the speaker. Not mocking, just kind of knowing. Then she said, "No, you're not. Not from where I'm standing." Something about her tone made my stomach tighten a little. It wasn't aggressive, just strange, like she was saying it from right beside me. But the signal was clean, no background noise. Usually you could tell when someone was moving or talking from their cab. Engine rumble, CB hiss, road sounds. But her signal was dead quiet. I asked, "Where you at?" And waited, but she didn't answer. Few seconds later, static rolled in. That crackling, distant kind that sounds like the radio breathing. Then, through the static, her voice came back faint but still clear enough to make out. "You should stop before mile marker 59, then silence. No carrier signal, no fade out, just gone." I sat there for a second, hand resting on the mic, watching the numbers on the dash clock tick forward. 59 was only a few miles ahead. I didn't pull over. There wasn't anywhere to stop anyway. Just an access road and flat fields on both sides. I figured she was either drunk, bored, or messing with whoever she could get to respond. It happens sometimes, lonely people with radios. You learn not to overthink it, but I'll admit, I kept glancing at the mile markers as I rolled past. 58, 59. The sign flashed by, white numbers catching the beams of my headlights, then disappeared into the darkness behind me. Nothing on the road. No vehicles. No fog yet, just a few scattered lights from distant farmhouses, and that constant wind pressing against the cab. About 20 minutes later, the fog started rolling in. Low, patchy at first, then thicker, enough that I had to ease off the throttle. Visibility dropped to maybe 100 feet. I flipped on the fog lights, kept it steady at 55. The radio stayed quiet the rest of the way through Kansas. I didn't hear her voice again, and after a while I stopped expecting to. I crossed into Colorado around 3 a.m. and reached Denver a little before dawn. Tired, but fine. The next morning, while I was parked at the yard eating breakfast from the diner next door, chatter started picking up on the CB. Mostly westbound drivers heading the same route I'd just taken. A few of them were talking about an accident near Colby, big one. 5 semis tangled up in the fog right around mile marker 59. They said it happened around 2 in the morning, maybe a little after. I remember just sitting there listening while stirring cold coffee, trying to picture the stretch of highway I'd been on. That section was flat and open. No curves, no intersections. It didn't make sense how that many trucks piled up. One guy said the fog had been blinding, worse than what I'd driven through. Another said there were flames by the time emergency crews got there. For the rest of the day, the radio kept buzzing with talk about it. Guys comparing notes, saying who knew who'd seen what. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't even really want to think about it. I told myself it was coincidence, that she'd probably been warning someone else. Or maybe she was parked nearby and saw something I couldn't. Still, it stuck with me, her exact words. The calm way she said them. Later that week, on another night run, I kept scanning through channels between Salina and Colby, half hoping I'd catch her again. I never did. I even stopped once at a truck stop near Goodland. Asked a few regulars if they'd ever heard a woman talking on 19 out there. Most shook their heads. One old-timer said there used to be a couple of locals who messed with drivers years back. But he hadn't heard a female voice in ages. The next time I drove that route. A few weeks later, I slowed down as I passed mile marker 59. The fog wasn't there anymore, just clear sky and open road. But you could still see the signs of the wreck, black streaks on the pavement, a section of guardrail replaced, bits of twisted reflector posts in the grass. There was a small wooden cross nailed to one of the posts, white paint already fading from the weather. Someone had left flowers, plastic ones, blue and yellow. I pulled onto the shoulder for a moment and turned off the engine. The night was still, just the sound of the wind moving through the fields. I sat there thinking about timing, how close it had been. I must have gone through there less than 15 minutes before it all happened. If I'd stopped like she'd said, maybe I'd have been parked in the middle of it when the fog rolled in. Or maybe I would have seen it start. Maybe even been able to call it in before it got that bad. Either way, it didn't feel like something I could explain to anyone. Just one of those moments that sits in your head afterward. The kind that changes the way you listen. I've done that run dozens of times since. Every time I cross into that stretch near Colby, I still keep channel 19 open, just in case. I never hear her, but I still catch myself checking my lights more often than before. Tapping the brakes at mile marker 59, glancing at the mirrors even when I know everything's fine. It's not fear exactly, just awareness. Like the road remembers something even if nobody talks about it anymore. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that. I've seen enough real things on the highway to know people can make up stranger stories than anything that's actually out there. But I also know that sometimes, in the middle of the night on an empty stretch of road, you catch something on the radio that makes you pause. Not because it's supernatural, but because it feels personal. Like someone saw what you couldn't or knew what was coming. I still don't know who that woman was or where she was calling from. Maybe she was just a local scanning channels, trying to warn whoever she could before the fog rolled in. Maybe she was parked at a rest area, watching headlights disappear into the mist. Maybe she was just guessing, same as anyone else. All I know is that night, for whatever reason, her voice cut through the static exactly when it needed to. Now every time I pass that marker, I slow down without even thinking. The fields on both sides look the same, flat, open, quiet. But that spot feels heavier somehow. There's something about knowing how fast everything can go from normal to chaos out there. 1 minute you're alone under clear sky. The next you're in fog so thick you can't see your own hood. Sometimes, late on the drive back east, I'll turn the CB off completely just to hear the road and the hum of the tires. But every now and then, when the night's too quiet, I'll flip channel 19 back on, listening through the static, waiting for that same calm voice to come through again. I never hear it. Still, I keep listening. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I pulled into the Loves off I-80 near Rawlins, Wyoming. February 2023. The wind had been howling hard for the last 100 miles, and the temperature gauge on the dash kept dipping lower and lower. The kind of cold that makes the air feel like broken glass in your lungs. I'd been hauling a flatbed load eastbound out of Rock Springs and figured I'd stop for fuel and coffee before pushing on toward Cheyenne. The lot was half empty, a few reefers idling in the corner, the wind cutting through everything with that dry, whistling sound that never really stops in Wyoming. I pulled up to the pump and stepped down, the crunch of the frozen slush under my boot sounding sharp and brittle. My breath came out in thick clouds. Even through my jacket, I could feel the sting of the cold. The wind pushed against me as I dragged the fuel hose around the side of the truck. My hands went stiff almost immediately. The diesel nozzle clunked into the tank, and I stood there letting it run, shifting from one foot to the other just to keep feeling in my toes. There wasn't another person outside, just the hum of engines, the hiss of the wind, and the occasional rattle of loose metal from the canopy over the pumps. When the tank filled, I capped it and went inside. The glass doors were fogged from the heat inside, and stepping through felt like moving between worlds. Frozen black night to the bright fluorescent hum of the store. The place was quiet, just one guy stocking shelves in the back and the clerk half asleep behind the counter. The smell of burnt coffee hit me as soon as I reached the self-serve pots. I filled my thermos, dumped in enough sugar to make it drinkable, and stood by the window for a moment, rubbing some warmth back into my hands before heading out. When I stepped back into the wind, it hit me even harder than before. My truck sat under one of the tall lamps, the metal glinting with a thin sheen of frost. I took a sip of coffee and started walking toward it, head down against the gusts. About halfway there, something made me slow down. Someone was sitting in my passenger seat. At first I thought maybe I was seeing my own reflection in the glass or a trick from the light. But the shape didn't move the way a reflection would. It was solid. A dark hooded figure sitting still, head slightly turned toward the windshield. My brain froze. The cab light was off, but enough light spilled in from the lamp overhead to see that whoever it was wasn't moving, just sitting there. My heart started pounding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. I stopped about 10 feet away, staring at that window, trying to make sense of it. I always lock my doors, always. I remembered hitting the lock before going inside. I stared for a few more seconds, thinking maybe someone broke in. Maybe it was some tweaker trying to get warm. I moved slowly around the front of the truck, my boots scraping over the icy asphalt. The figure didn't react. I knocked on the glass with my knuckle. 3 quick taps, nothing, not a twitch. I felt my chest tightening. I tried to peer closer, squinting against the glare of the light, and for a second it looked like whoever it was had frost or wetness on their coat, glistening slightly. I went around to the driver's side, my keys shaking in my hand. The locks were still engaged. That made no sense. I took a deep breath, hit unlock, and yanked the door open, half expecting someone to lunge at me. The seat was empty. I froze there, one foot on the step, staring across the cab. Passenger seat soaked, dark, wet patches spreading through the fabric like melted snow had been dripping there for a while. The floor mat glistened under the overhead light, puddled with water. The air inside the cab felt damp, cold. My own breath fogged the windshield. Right there on the seat was a single glove, small, maybe the size of one you'd see on a kid. It was soaked through, dark from moisture, fingertips limp. I just stood there for a long time, trying to figure it out. I leaned out, looked around the lot. Nobody near me, just the steady sound of wind tearing through the rows of parked trucks. My eyes went back to the wet seat, the glove. It didn't make any sense. Doors locked, nobody around. Yet the seat looked like someone had been sitting there soaked through. I got back out, shut the door, and walked a slow circle around the rig with my flashlight, checking the catwalk, the steps, even under the trailer. Just snow and wind. No footprints leading up to the cab that I could see, though with all the drifting powder, maybe they'd already been covered. I went back inside to the counter and asked the manager if he could check the cameras. He looked tired but agreed, scrolling through the feed on the monitor behind the counter. We went frame by frame for the few minutes I'd been inside. Nothing. The camera caught me walking in, the empty fuel island behind me. No one else approached the truck, no movement near it at all. Just the wind and blowing snow. When I went back outside again, the truck looked exactly the same. I didn't want to sit in it, but I had to get moving. I picked up the glove between two fingers, tossed it in the trash bin by the pump, and climbed in. The seat was still wet. I grabbed a towel from my side box and dried it as best I could before settling in. The cab smelled faintly like wet wool after that. Not strong, but enough that I noticed it every time I got in for the next couple days. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe condensation from the heater mixing with the cold. Maybe I'd spilled something without realizing. But that didn't explain the glove or the shape I saw sitting there so clearly under the light. A few nights later, parked at a rest area near Laramie, I heard it for the first time. I'd been half asleep in the sleeper when a faint sound woke me. Soft, short squeaks. At first I thought it was one of the belts in the dash, but it wasn't mechanical. It sounded like footsteps. Wet shoes on linoleum. Slow, spaced apart like someone walking just behind the cab. I sat still, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I got out, looked around with my flashlight. Nothing. The ground was frozen solid, no prints. I brushed it off, but it kept happening. Every few stops, usually late at night when everything was quiet, I'd hear that same faint squeak. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes farther off, but always when I was alone. I started checking under the trailer every time I fueled, checking the steps, checking inside before locking up. Never found anything. After a week of it, I started to feel stupid for even noticing, but it wore on me. Sleep got harder. I'd wake up in the sleeper to that sound, my heart racing, convinced someone was moving just outside the door. The one time I opened it fast, flashlight ready, the wind hit me hard and there was nothing but the dark and the snow. Eventually, I stopped at a wash bay in North Platte to clean out the cab. I vacuumed, wiped everything down, sprayed disinfectant on the seat. I wanted every trace of that damp smell gone. The towel I'd used that first night was still in the side box, stiff and frozen from where I'd thrown it in without thinking. When I unrolled it, a small piece of black fabric fell out from the folds. Looked like part of that same glove, the seam along the wrist. That was the moment it finally settled in me that whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, wasn't just some trick of the light. Someone somehow had gotten close enough to my truck that night to leave water pooled in the seat, and a child's glove behind, and no camera caught them. Maybe they were hiding in the lot. Maybe they were already inside before I stopped, waiting to get warm, slipping out unseen when I went inside. The cold out there can make people do strange things, desperate things. After that, I started checking my locks twice, sometimes 3 times before leaving the cab. I stopped parking under the bright lights and started choosing the corners of lots where the cameras didn't glare off the windows, where I could see the reflections myself. The squeaks faded over time, or maybe I just stopped listening for them. But even now, when I fuel at night and the wind cuts across the concrete, sometimes I catch that faint sound again, just enough to make me glance at the passenger seat, expecting to see a wet shape sitting there waiting. And every time, even when it's empty, I can still smell that trace of cold, damp wool in the air, like it never really left. It was late August 2018, the kind of night that never really cools down, even in the desert. I was northbound on US 93, running a load of industrial supplies out of Phoenix, headed toward Las Vegas. It was 2:40 in the morning, that dead hour when the road feels endless and empty, when even the air seems half asleep. The dash thermometer read 94 degrees, and the asphalt shimmered faintly under the high beams, still bleeding heat from the day before. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the tires blending into the steady vibration of the cab. My left arm hung out the window, fingers catching the dry wind, while the right hand rested loosely on the wheel. The desert stretched out on both sides, a sea of black sand and scrub, broken only by the occasional fence post or reflector. That stretch between Kingman and Hoover Dam feels like another planet at night. No houses, no towns, just long stretches of highway that disappear into the dark. You could drive for 10 miles and not see another set of headlights. I'd just passed the chloride turnoff sign when I saw her, a woman standing on the shoulder. White dress, long hair hanging down past her shoulders, barefoot. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The high beams hit her full on, and she didn't flinch, didn't move. She wasn't waving for help or flagging me down. She just stood there staring straight at the pavement. My first thought was that she'd been in some kind of accident. Maybe a broken down car nearby, maybe someone hurt or stranded. I've seen my share of wrecks in the desert, and the idea of someone being left out there in that heat, at that hour, hit me hard. I eased off the throttle, the engine brake growling as I slowed down. The trailer hissed as I came to a stop, maybe 50 yards past where she'd been standing. When I got out, the heat hit me like an oven door opening. The air was thick and still, the smell of burnt rubber and hot dust heavy in my nose. I grabbed my flashlight from the step compartment and walked around the front of the truck, scanning the shoulder behind me. My boots crunched on the gravel as I swung the beam across the highway. Nothing. I pointed the light at the spot where she'd been, expecting to see footprints in the dirt, maybe some disturbed dust or a sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the wind brushing over the desert and the faint hiss of the engine cooling. I turned the beam toward the other side of the road, empty. No car lights, no movement, no sound. It was like she'd never been there. For a few seconds I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. My pulse was hammering in my ears and the silence made it worse. I thought maybe I'd missed her somehow. Maybe she'd walked off into the desert, or maybe there was a culvert she'd gone into. I walked a few yards toward the spot, shining the light along the ground. Still nothing. No tire tracks, no sign of anyone walking, just undisturbed sand and scattered rocks. The longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. Something about the stillness, the way the desert just swallowed up the light. I started feeling exposed, like standing out there was a bad idea. There was no one around, and the idea of a lone woman being out there barefoot at 2:40 a.m. didn't make sense. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would walk. I backed up slowly toward the truck, the flashlight beam jittering a little from my unsteady grip. When I climbed back into the cab, I locked the doors without thinking, and sat for a second, just breathing hard and listening to the idling engine. I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking up from the darkness. After a minute, I decided to keep moving. Whatever I'd seen, it was gone, and staying there wasn't helping. I eased the truck back onto the highway, shifting up through the gears until the hum of the road settled back into its rhythm. But I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirrors, the image of her standing there came back. That pale dress, that still posture, the way she didn't even look at me when the lights hit her. About a mile up the road, I checked my mirrors again out of habit, and that's when I saw her. Same spot, same white dress. This time she was facing me, standing right where she'd been before, perfectly still. My chest went cold. For a moment I thought maybe it was my taillights reflecting weird off something, a signpost or a rock. But no, it was her. The shape was unmistakable. I didn't stop again. I kept driving, trying to focus on the yellow lines and not look back. The desert felt endless. Every shadow on the shoulder looked like it could be her again. The road curved slightly, and I lost sight of that spot in the mirror. But my heart didn't slow down until I was near Boulder City. When I finally pulled into the truck stop in Henderson, the air was cooler, but my hands were still sweating on the wheel. I parked in the far lot under one of the sodium lights and just sat there for a while with the engine off. The hum of the reefer units around me was the only sound. I replayed the whole thing in my head, trying to make it make sense. Maybe it had been a trick of the light or exhaustion. I hadn't had more than 4 hours of sleep the night before, but it had felt too real. I got out and stretched, pacing a bit in the lot, drinking from a bottle of warm water. My shirt was sticking to my back. I looked around at the other trucks, the shadows moving under the lights, and for some reason it felt safer there, surrounded by steel and diesel noise. That empty stretch of desert felt far away, but the image of her didn't leave me. I went inside the diner attached to the station to grab a coffee and something to eat. The place was nearly empty. A few drivers scattered in the booths, a waitress wiping down the counter. The smell of burnt coffee and frying oil hung in the air. I sat near the window facing the lot. My eyes kept drifting toward the glass, half expecting to see someone standing out there, barefoot on the pavement. I didn't say anything about it for a while. It just sat in my head, replaying every few minutes. The longer I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt, like I'd missed something obvious. I told myself it was probably nothing. Heat haze, maybe, or some weird shadow from a reflector post. But the part that didn't fit was how real she looked. The way the dress had moved slightly in the heat ripple. The way the light caught her hair. Later that morning when I was fueling up before heading out, another driver I knew pulled in beside me. We'd crossed paths a few times before. He ran a similar route. We talked a bit about the traffic near the dam and the heat. Eventually, I mentioned what I'd seen. I didn't expect much, just needed to get it off my chest. He stopped mid-motion, looking at me with this blank, serious expression. His tone didn't change, but the air around us felt heavier. He told me that stretch between Kingman and Hoover had a bad history. A lot of people pulled over there for stranded pedestrians and never saw anyone. Others found abandoned shoes or personal items near the shoulder. He said people dumped bodies out there all the time, far from any cameras or traffic. That hit me harder than I expected. The image of her barefoot, the stillness, the way she didn't move when the light hit her, it all lined up in a way I didn't want to think about. Maybe she wasn't standing there waiting for help. Maybe she'd already been there for a long time. Maybe what I saw wasn't someone alive at all, but the aftermath of something terrible that had happened hours earlier. I thought about the untouched dirt, how there were no footprints, no signs of movement. It didn't make sense that she could vanish that fast, unless she'd never moved to begin with, unless whoever left her there had done it long before I passed through. That drive stuck with me. Every time I've run that route since, I keep my eyes straight ahead when I pass the chloride turnoff. I don't look at the shoulder, not even for a second. Because whatever I saw that night, whether it was a trick of the light, exhaustion, or something I don't want to understand, I know one thing for sure. There are places out there in the desert where bad things happen. And if you're smart, you don't stop to find out why. Summer 2015 was one of the loneliest stretches of my life. I was running freight at night for a small outfit based out of Redding, hauling pallets of produce and dry goods up through the mountains into southern Oregon. The pay wasn't great, but I liked the quiet. Most nights it was just me, the hum of the diesel and the long black line of highway winding up through the dark trees. You learn to live by the rhythm of the road, when to take a pull out for coffee, which rest stops have clean bathrooms, and which spots you don't ever pull into after midnight. That night, I'd been on the road since a little after 9. I remember the air was heavy and still, the kind of summer heat that doesn't let go even after the sun goes down. I had the window cracked open, letting in the smell of dry pine and hot asphalt. My dash clock said 2:15 a.m. when I crested the Siskiyou summit. I had the radio low, some talk station fading in and out of static. I was running a little behind schedule, but not by much. A few miles past the summit, I felt a sudden tug in the trailer, subtle but enough to make me glance at the mirrors. Something didn't look right. One of the rear straps must have come loose. It happens sometimes when the load shifts on the climb. I figured I'd pull off somewhere safe, tighten it down, and be back on the road in 5 minutes. There's a small overpass there, a narrow spot with just enough shoulder for a rig if you hug the guardrail. I flipped on my hazards and rolled to a stop beneath the bridge. The headlights washed over the concrete, yellow and cracked with old graffiti half faded from the weather. Everything around was quiet, except for the ticking of the engine and the sound of bugs smacking against the windshield. I grabbed my flashlight from the dash, climbed down, and the night closed in around me. Out there, the darkness feels thick, almost solid. It presses on you. My boots crunched gravel as I walked around the trailer, sweeping the beam along the straps. Sure enough, one had come loose near the back end, dragging slightly against the pavement. I crouched to tighten it, the beam of light bouncing along the underside of the trailer. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the bridge, low and uneven. But then I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was breathing, slow, ragged, wet-sounding, coming from under the bridge itself. I froze, the strap still in my hand. The sound came again, closer this time, echoing off the concrete. My light swung toward the columns beneath the overpass. There was movement behind one of them. Something crouched low, just outside the edge of my light. I took a step back, trying to focus. Then my beam caught him. It was a man. He was sitting in a kind of squat, arms hanging loose between his knees. He wasn't wearing pants, just a filthy, torn jacket that looked soaked through at the sleeves. His skin was pale and smeared with dirt, and when the light hit his face, his eyes reflected back, glassy, wide, almost animal-like. He blinked a few times like the light hurt him, and I remember the way his chest heaved when he breathed, that wet, rattling sound. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I just stood there holding the light, and he stayed crouched in the shadows. I don't know what made me do it, but I reached into the truck door pocket and grabbed what I had left of a sandwich I'd been eating earlier. I didn't say anything. I just held it out a little, half expecting him to take it. He moved fast. Before I could react, he lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong, way stronger than I expected, and the shock of it made me drop the flashlight. It rolled across the gravel, spinning the beam wildly across the underside of the bridge. That's when the smell hit me, sweet, rotten, metallic. Blood, sweat, something spoiled. His hand was burning hot, like touching someone with a high fever. I yanked, tried to twist free, but his nails dug into my skin. I remember the sound of his breathing getting louder, harsher, almost desperate. Somehow I tore loose and stumbled backward, hitting the side of the trailer. My elbow slammed against the metal hard enough to numb my arm, but I didn't stop. I scooped up the flashlight and ran. I don't even remember climbing into the cab. 1 second I was outside. The next I was slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I floored it, the whole rig lurching forward. The flashlight rolled off the seat and hit the floorboard, its beam flashing across my legs as I pulled back onto the highway. I drove for miles without even looking in the mirrors. My heart didn't stop pounding until I saw the lights of Ashland in the distance. When I finally got cell service, I called CHP. My voice was unsteady, and I must have sounded like a maniac. I told them what happened, where I'd stopped, what I saw under the bridge. They told me to pull into a truck stop and wait for a call back. I parked at a Chevron near Medford and sat there in the cab for nearly half an hour, trying to calm down. My wrist ached where he'd grabbed me. There were faint crescent marks from his nails and a smear of something dark, like dried blood. I wiped it off with a paper towel, but the smell stayed on my skin. About 40 minutes later, an officer called. He said they'd checked the spot and found signs someone had been living there. A few torn blankets, an old camp stove, a pile of trash. But no person. He sounded casual, like it wasn't anything unusual. People sometimes take shelter under those bridges, he said. They'd send a crew to clean it up. I didn't say much after that. Just thanked him and hung up. I drove the rest of the way in silence. Every sound from the trailer made me jump. The clock on the dash read 4:37 a.m. when I finally parked at the Medford depot. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was starting to lighten, that dull gray blue just before dawn. I sat there for a long time, staring at my hands. The skin around my wrist looked slightly red and puffy, like a burn. I washed it with soap in the bathroom sink before checking in my delivery papers. I didn't tell anyone else about it. Not the dispatcher, not the other drivers. I figured they'd think I was half asleep or imagining things. But for weeks after, I couldn't shake it. Every night run through that stretch made my stomach tighten. I'd glance at every overpass, every patch of shadow along the road, half expecting to see someone standing there. The strangest part was the heat. I kept thinking about how his hand felt. Not cold like you'd expect from someone living rough under a bridge, not clammy or weak. It was hot, fever hot, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. That detail stuck with me the most. About a month later, I stopped at the same truck stop where I'd made that call. There was another driver there I knew from the route. We got talking about strange things you see on the road. He mentioned hearing that CHP had cleared a camp under that overpass a while back. Said they found a lot of blood and a pile of bones from small animals. He didn't know if it was true, just something he'd heard over the radio chatter. I didn't ask any questions. I switched routes that fall, started hauling local runs around Chico instead of long hauls north. I told people it was because I wanted to be closer to home, but that wasn't the full reason. The truth was, I couldn't stand passing through that stretch anymore. Every time I saw a bridge in the dark, I'd remember the breathing, the grip, and that unbearable heat. Even now, years later, I still feel it sometimes when I think about that night. The weight of that hand on my wrist, the smell, the look in those glassy eyes. I know he was human. I know what I saw. But something about him didn't feel right. Not in a supernatural way, just wrong in a way you can't explain. Like something had burned out inside him, but the body kept going. I don't stop under overpasses anymore. Not for straps, not for anything. If something's loose, it can wait until daylight. I'd rather lose a pallet than ever step back under one of those bridges again. I was headed north on I-29 through Iowa in the early hours of a February morning, hauling about 45,000 pounds of steel coils on the flatbed. The wind had been cutting through the open fields all night, pushing the trailer just enough to make me keep both hands tight on the wheel. It had started snowing lightly around Council Bluffs, and by the time I was north of Missouri Valley, the road had turned slick in that way that only black ice can manage. No shine, no warning, just smooth glass hiding beneath a thin crust of frost. Every time I hit a bridge, I could feel the truck shift slightly, like it wanted to slide sideways. It was close to 4 a.m., that quiet stretch of time when your mind starts playing tricks on you. After too many hours on the road, most of the truck stops were dark, and the CB chatter had died down hours earlier. I'd been keeping a steady 55, slower than usual, but I didn't want to risk it. The temperature was sitting just below freezing, and the air was so dry it almost hurt to breathe. Every few miles, a gust of wind would blow snow across the highway, erasing the lane markings for a few seconds. That's when I noticed him. Another flatbed, maybe 2 lanes over at first, coming up from behind me. I only caught his marker lights at first. No headlights, just that faint orange glow along the trailer edges. I thought maybe his headlights were dim or covered in snow, but as he pulled even with me, it was clear they were off. No reflection off the road, no glare on the mirrors. Just the dull line of amber lights floating beside me in the dark. He matched my speed perfectly, maybe a few feet to the right. I could just make out the outline of the cab through the drifting snow, but there was no company logo I could read. No driver visible through the window. It was strange, but not impossible. Some guys drove like that, figuring the marker lights were enough on a lonely stretch of highway. I reached for the CB mic clipped under the dash and keyed it. Hey, flatbed on the northbound. You running dark on purpose? Nothing, just static. I tried again, adding a little more bite to my voice, but still nothing. The channel stayed dead quiet. I figured maybe his radio was off, or he was just ignoring me, but something about it made the hairs stand up on my neck. He kept perfectly even with me. No weaving, no slowing, just dead on matching my pace. The road had narrowed to 2 lanes each way, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight. Just the hum of my engine and the low growl of the tires against ice. After a few miles of that, he started drifting closer, slowly, like gravity was pulling him toward me. Our mirrors were nearly level, and I could see the dark shape of his cab moving closer in my peripheral vision. I tapped my brakes lightly, trying to create a little space. The trailer rocked just enough for me to feel the weight of those steel coils behind me shift forward a few inches. He didn't back off. I gave a short blast on the air horn. The sound echoed across the frozen fields. The other flatbed jerked slightly, then just like that, he was gone. 1 second beside me, the next he'd fallen back into the darkness behind. I checked my mirrors, but all I could see were faint orange lights fading into the night until they disappeared completely. I didn't see any exit ramps for several miles. No way he could have turned off without me noticing. The highway was straight, open farmland in every direction. I told myself he'd just backed off, maybe spooked by the horn. Still, the feeling didn't sit right. I kept checking the mirrors for another 10 minutes, half expecting those marker lights to reappear. A few minutes later, I saw the reflection of flashing red and blue lights up ahead, bouncing off the snow-covered shoulder. I slowed to a crawl. The closer I got, the clearer it became that there'd been a wreck. A semi was overturned in the ditch, steam hissing from the crushed front end. One of the steel coil straps hanging loose from the twisted flatbed. The troopers had just started setting out flares, the bright orange flickers glowing against the dark ice. I pulled off onto the shoulder about 100 feet past the scene, set my hazards, and climbed out. The cold hit me hard, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose. My boots crunched over the icy gravel as I walked back. The smell of hot oil and coolant hung in the air, thick and sour. The cab was on its side, windshield shattered, snow packed into the cracks like frostbite. A state trooper in a reflective jacket stepped toward me, waving his flashlight. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the wind, but his gesture made it clear. I wasn't needed. Another trooper was already kneeling near the cab door, speaking quietly to the EMTs who had just arrived. I stopped a few feet short, standing near the guardrail. The whole thing looked too fresh. Steam still poured from the radiator, and the trailer's load had shifted halfway off the bed. The trooper walked up to me. I could tell from his body language there was no rush left in his movements. I asked if I could help, but he just shook his head and said the driver didn't make it. They'd just gotten the call about 15 minutes ago. Dispatch said a truck had gone off the road before anyone even arrived. I stood there for a second, staring at the wreckage. The shape of the truck was too familiar. The flatbed, the side rails, the faint orange glow from the marker lights still flickering along the edge of the trailer. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against ice. One of the troopers was writing the DOT number down from the side of the cab. My eyes followed it as he spoke the digits into his radio. It was the same number I'd seen on the side of the flatbed that had been pacing me. Same company markings, same trailer configuration, the same truck. For a long moment I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. My mind refused to line up the timeline. The trooper said they'd gotten the call 15 minutes ago, maybe 20 at most. But I'd seen that flatbed beside me less than 10 minutes back. Close enough to touch mirrors. Close enough to see the outline of his cab through the snow. There was no way the wreck could have happened before I'd even passed that stretch. I told myself, maybe it was another truck from the same company. Maybe even with the same DOT number if they hadn't updated the decals yet. It wasn't impossible. But as I looked closer, I noticed the right side of the cab was scraped almost clean of snow, like something had been rubbing along it. The rest was caked in frost. I couldn't shake the image of him sliding closer to me earlier, our mirrors nearly touching. His truck angled slightly my way. When the troopers started clearing traffic through, I climbed back into my rig and sat for a while before starting the engine. My gloves were still cold, stiff with sweat. I wiped the fog off the windshield and just stared at the road ahead, at the faint lights of other trucks disappearing into the dark distance. I pulled out slow, keeping it at 40 all the way to Sioux City. Every few miles, I'd glance in the mirror expecting to see those faint orange marker lights beside me again. They never showed. But even now, years later, I still remember how close he'd been. Close enough that I could feel the air between the rigs shift. Close enough that if I'd moved just a few inches the wrong way, one of us would have ended up in the ditch. It wasn't a ghost story or anything supernatural. Sometimes on the highway, things happen too fast or too quietly to notice until it's too late. Maybe the guy was already losing control when he drifted toward me. Maybe the ice caught him just as he tried to correct. Maybe when he vanished behind me, that was the moment his truck went sideways and left the road for good. I'll never really know. All I know is that on nights like that, when the air's cold enough to freeze the mirrors and the road looks dry but isn't, I still find myself watching the edges of my lane for faint orange lights glowing through the snow, just to make sure they stay where they belong. It was September of 2019, somewhere around 1 in the morning, hauling out of Dallas headed for Nashville. I'd been on the road since early afternoon, and by that point the glow from the dash lights had started to blur a little. The hum of the tires on I-40 had turned hypnotic. I'd been fighting the nods for the last half hour, slapping my face, cracking the window, taking long pulls from a warm energy drink, anything to stay alert. But once the road quiets down like that, no headlights behind you, no brake lights ahead, it's like your brain starts sinking into the hum of the engine. Every bump feels slower, every mile longer. I knew I needed to pull over before I drifted across a lane. Just past Little Rock, I saw a narrow exit sign flash by. No text, just the standard green post, half-rusted reflective sticker peeling away. It didn't even look like a real exit, more like one of those old service ramps. But my eyelids were heavy, and I figured I could use it just to park and stretch. I slowed down and took it. The ramp was dirt right away, uneven, with weeds growing up through cracks. No lights, no reflector posts, no signs of maintenance. I had to downshift to keep from rattling too hard as the tractor bounced over the ruts. The ramp curved off to the right, away from the highway. The sound of the interstate faded behind me, until it was nothing but the idle of my truck and the gravel popping under the tires. Then it opened into a wide, cracked lot. Looked like it used to be paved decades ago. Chunks of asphalt split apart by grass and old oil stains that had turned to black patches. At the far end of the lot sat a low, rectangular building. Looked like an old diner from the 70s, with a long awning and a faded red roof. But the windows were boarded up with plywood sheets. The sign above the entrance was just a rusted frame with no letters left. The kind of place that probably closed 20 years back and nobody bothered to tear down. But there was light inside, faint yellow light, like the kind you get from a single bulb or a lantern. It wasn't bright enough to spill through the cracks in the boards, just enough to give a dull glow through one of the gaps near the door. I sat there idling for a bit, staring. Maybe someone was squatting there, or maybe it was used as storage by some local trucking outfit. I didn't know, but I was too tired to think straight. I just wanted to get out, stretch my legs, and grab something from the back. I pulled my truck to the side of the lot, nose angled toward the way I came in, habit from years of not wanting to get boxed in. I killed the headlights but left the parking lights on, grabbed a snack pack from the sleeper, and stepped out. The air was thick and damp, smelled like wet dirt and old oil. The sky was clear, but the stars looked faint behind a thin layer of haze. Crickets were loud somewhere out in the grass. The only light came from the dash glow inside my cab, and that dim yellow flicker from the boarded diner. At first, everything seemed still. Then I heard a low hum like an engine running somewhere nearby. I walked around the front of my truck to look toward the building, and that's when I saw them. 3 cars parked behind the diner, half hidden in shadow. No plates on any of them. One of them, a dark-colored sedan, was still idling. The exhaust drifted slow and white in the cool air. Something about it snapped me awake fast. I stopped where I was, snack pack still in my hand. None of the cars looked new. Older models, like early 2000s. The glass on one was missing, covered with a plastic sheet. I could see movement behind one of the cars, a shape. Someone stepped out from behind it. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket even though it wasn't cold. He was holding a flashlight under his chin, angling it upward so his face was in shadow, but the beam caught the front of my truck. He started scanning my rig slowly, moving the light up over the grill, the side door, the fuel tank. Then he turned toward me. The flashlight hit me full in the chest. For a second I couldn't see anything but that bright spot. Then the beam dipped slightly and I saw him start walking toward me. Not running, just walking fast, steady. Something in my gut went hard. I didn't say anything. I just turned and went back for the cab. I could hear the crunch of gravel picking up behind me faster. I missed the handle on the first grab, hands shaking a little, then got hold of it and yanked myself up. My door wasn't even shut all the way when I hit the clutch and fired the ignition. The truck roared, headlights still off, but I didn't care. I slammed it into gear, dumped the clutch, and felt the trailer lurch behind me as the tires spun and bit into the dirt. I caught a quick glimpse of him in the mirror, flashlight beam swinging wildly now as he turned away from the truck, maybe back toward the building. I didn't stick around to find out. I hit the ramp going too fast, bouncing hard enough to make everything in the cab rattle. One of the drawers in the sleeper popped open and slammed shut again. I kept going until I hit the asphalt of the interstate. When I merged back on, I realized my hands were shaking so bad that I could barely keep the wheel straight. The adrenaline hit late, like a wave that makes your chest tight. I drove for another 40 minutes before I found a proper rest stop with trucks lined up and bright lights everywhere. I parked in the middle of them, stepped out, walked a few circles just to calm down. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flashlight beam in those plateless cars. It didn't make sense. Why would 3 cars be behind an abandoned building at 1 in the morning? One of them still idling. No lights on, no plates. Maybe it was some kind of chop shop setup. Maybe people running drugs or hiding stolen vehicles. Whatever it wasn't just some random locals hanging out. The next morning, with some daylight and coffee in me, I figured I'd check the place on the map. Just out of curiosity, I pulled out my phone, opened Google Maps, zoomed in around the stretch where I thought I'd turned off. But there was nothing. No exit, no service road, no diner, no open area. Just a long green patch of trees and farmland. I zoomed closer, still nothing. Just empty land on both sides of the highway. I tried Street View. Closest spot I could get was a few miles before and after where I thought it was. But both sides of the road looked the same. Dense trees, old fence lines, no break in the guardrail. I even scrolled through satellite mode. Zoomed in until it blurred. There was no sign of any building, no lot, nothing that even looked like a dirt ramp. I sat there staring at the screen for a while, not sure what to think. I hadn't imagined it. My tires were still covered in dried mud from that lot. I remembered every detail. The cracked asphalt, the boarded windows, the idling car, the man with the flashlight. I didn't imagine the way the truck bounced when I pulled out of there, or the sound of gravel hitting the undercarriage. The rest of the drive to Nashville felt longer than usual. Every unmarked exit I passed made my shoulders tense. I kept thinking about how quiet it had been down there, how that man didn't shout or wave, just walked toward me like he already knew I wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't anger or surprise in the way he moved. It was purpose, like he was guarding something. When I got to the yard in Nashville, I checked my rig top to bottom before dropping the trailer, just out of habit. Mud still caked under the steps, same color as the dirt from that ramp. I hosed it off, but the feeling stuck. I still drive that route every few months and every time I pass Little Rock at night. I make damn sure I stay in the center lane, eyes forward. No stopping until I see proper signs and lights. Whatever that place was, it wasn't on any map, and I've never seen it again. Sometimes I think maybe it was an old diner property someone used for something they didn't want found. Other times, when the road gets quiet again and I feel that same tired pull, I think about how easy it would have been to keep walking toward that light, just to see what was inside. But I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. Because if I had hesitated even a few seconds longer, I don't think I'd have made it back to that highway at all.